Greetings, class. This lecture is just a brief history of the American healthcare system, just so we can set the stage as we work through the textbook and work through our course. If you go back to the early English settlers after they got off the Mayflower and made the trip across the Atlantic, there was actually two physicians on the ship that came over with the early settlers. Medicine back in those days was quite different than what it was today. And the thing about it was it never really changed much until the mid 1800s. So from early on to like BC, up until literally into the 1700s, most medicine was all revolved around an ancient Greek theory that all life on the planet had four elements to it. Those four elements were fire, earth, and water. And physicians looked at the human body and life with humans with that same Greek philosophy or that same Greek concept, to where the body's fluids, if you will, all related to life and all related to those four elements of fire, earth, water, and air. So, for example, when physicians looked at the body, blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile all represented the four elements of life. And it was this Greek concept or the Greek philosophy that a physician's job was to maintain that balance of fluid in the body when somebody was sick. So it was thought that when somebody was sick, they had a fever, they weren't feeling well, they had a headache, that one of those four bodily fluids was off. And so it was the physician's job to maintain balance of those fluids in the body. And so they did it by just horrific measures, by bleeding people, by purging them, literally making you throw up, blistering you with heat and fire, enemas, and various medicines that they had concocted from back in the day. And, I use the term medicine loosely because a lot of what they did was poisonous back in the day. They just put these herbal concoctions together. One popular form of medicine back in that day, or concoction, was this right here, this calomel, which was just really a form of mercury. And I'm sure, as you know, mercury is actually poisonous in the body. And another example of some medicines that they used back in the day was a diet of pepper. If you had a cold, well, then the doctor would give you pepper to eat, for a couple of days to see if they could get rid of your cold. Very interesting. So in early medicine in the U.S., early American medicine, as settlers, English settlers, and people came over to settle the new land, and with physicians, when they would come over on the boats and try to set up their practices, if you didn't have any money, you couldn't see a doctor. A doctor wasn't going to see you. You didn't have money, couldn't pay for it, doctor's not going to see you, right? Same thing today, to an extent. And so back in early times in America, when we were settling the land, we had extended families, large homes, a lot of people living under the same roof. And so when you didn't have any money, you couldn't see a doctor. So that sort of paved the way to a lot of home remedies and extended families taking care of each other's. And that's where the medical professions of what we know today as midwifery and nursing, that's sort of how they got their early starts, was through home remedies and through extended families taking care of each other at home. When you did go see a doctor, you didn't necessarily make it out alive. There's a lot of deaths back in the 1700s, early 1800s, a lot of deaths from medical malpractice. Doctors didn't really know what they were doing, and not a lot of doctors even really cared what they were doing. They were trying to make money off of pretending that they were a doctor and really using a lot of human experimentation. So when you saw a doctor, it was not uncommon for somebody to pass away. And so a lot of times home remedies were much more successful than seeing a traditional doctor from back in those days. But doctors were looked at, as sort of almost godly, if you will, and they had this superiority complex, So because doctors were looked on so highly and regarded so highly, people wanted to go see him if they had money. But just because you went and saw one didn't necessarily mean that you were going to be any better off. doctors and surgeons were looked on quite differently back in those days. If we go back, in, into European medicine and European culture before they came over and settled into the U.S., physicians were looked on very scholarly and highly. But the thing about physicians is that they didn't really operate on the body. They didn't really have anything to do with the human body as far as cutting, amputations, bleeding patients, things of that nature. They left that up to barbers and surgeons. Barbers, where you go get your hair cut, and surgeons, which did amputations and would bleed people and bleed patients, worked under the same roof, and physicians sort of operated on their own and were looked on, like I said, very highly. The reason that physicians didn't really cut and bleed people or do amputations and surgeries and things of that nature was because of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church looked at the body as like it was a sacred temple, and it was just really looked down on to do anything to that temple, if you will. So back in those times, if you had a gangrene limb or something, or if you did see a doctor and the doctor recommended to be bled or bleeding, you would go to a barber shop, right? You would see a surgeon, and they would do that, perform that medical service at that facility. And it wasn't until this big, hairy, burly-looking guy right here, who was King Louis XIV, he had a problem. He had a bump on his bottom, or what's called a hemorrhoid, or an anal fissure. Don't know what one of those is? Go ahead and Google it. But he had the problem, and he had this problem, and no doctor in his court, if you will, could fix it. They tried all sorts of stuff, and nothing really worked. And so it was such an irritable issue, this growing anal fissure, or this growing this growing hemorrhoid that he had, that he sought out a surgeon. He was desperate. He didn't care what the Catholic Church said. And so the surgeon cut it off. And it was almost like it was instantaneous relief. And so King Louis rewarded this surgeon with all sorts of gold and gave him titles and lands. And so that was really sort of one of the, an example in the early times where physicians and surgeons started to mold together and put their heads together to see if their professions could help each other out, and in turn, make better medical practice. And so that was sort of a fork in the road for surgeons at the time, to where they split away from the Barbers Guild and went over and started to study medicine more and work under physicians more. And those two groups started learning off of each other, coming over into America, really, and physicians and surgeons started setting up practice to try to make the medical field a little bit better. In a nutshell, back in the early settling days, when people were really coming over from England and from Europe and settling into the U.S., in a nutshell, it was all congenital diseases and contagious disease were what killed a lot of people back in those days. So, for example, if you were born with childhood diabetes, because doctors and physicians didn't know what it was, if you had something you were born with, a congenital condition, you probably died early in life. And a lot in those days, there was a lot of like epidemics going around. A lot of people lived in fear, yellow fever, dysentery. If you caught one of these microbacterial conditions, you probably died. Doctors didn't really know what the heck was causing some of these conditions, and so and because they were very highly contagious, transferred from person to person, you lived in fear. And if you got the yellow fever or the sweating sickness was one of an example, what they called it back in the day, or dysentery. If you caught one of those conditions, you died a miserable death. A lot of rural and agricultural farms settling in the U.S. In the early settling days, and if you got a minor cut when you were working on the farm or building a house, because it wasn't really common knowledge of this idea of germs yet, so that if you got a cut, a lot of times it got infected, it turned gangrenous, and you'd have to get it amputated. It wasn't until about the mid 1800s that a group of physicians discovered microorganisms, this idea of little pathogens that were causing these infections and were causing yellow fever and some of these contagious diseases. Okay? So they got together, started, with the early development of microscopes and look at some of these diseases and some of these cultures underneath the microscope, that they discovered germs, and they published this textbook of cellular pathology. Um, and when germs and germ theory really started to come out in the mid 1800s, that was really a platform of developing successful medicine and successful treatments of what we see going on today, especially in the pharmaceutical industry. Because up until that point, right, up until the point of discovering these germs and pathogens and microorganisms, basically from early times BC up until the early 1800s, physicians were doing a technique of medicine called heroic medicine. And this right here is an excerpt from a textbook that sort of defines what heroic medicine means. And just to read right out of this excerpt from this other textbook, it says heroic medicine, their techniques, referring to physicians' techniques on how they took care of patients, was rooted in the notion that the way to exercise one set of afflictions, or the way to get rid of or cure one set of afflictions in a patient, was to subject that patient to a considerably more violent set of afflictions. The heroics were entirely on the part of the patient. For even the mildest ailments, one could expect to be bled, leeched, cupped, blistered, amputated, sweated. That's pronounced something different. I guess I pronounce it weird, call it trepanned, and we'll get into what that is in a minute. It's a lovely little thing. Scoured, purged, and flayed until fare thee well, meaning that if you had a headache or if you were sick, that physicians would subject your body to just horrific afflictions and violent afflictions to your body that most of the time they killed you. And it was very barbaric. I mean, for example, trepan right here. If you had a headache, you can see that. If you had a headache, what they used to do back in the day was they would take your head, hopefully you can see that, and they'd drill a little hole into you. I mean, give me a break. And what they were doing was trying to, they would release, the evil toxins out of your head in order to alleviate the headache. And what that picture is showing right here is some, at Egyptian burial sites of digging up old skulls. And this is people that were getting trepan back in the day, getting their heads drilled and parts of their skull removed in order to alleviate a headache. Okay, barbaric stuff. Today in our modern medical society, we do have examples of heroic medicine. It's more cancer and chemo treatments. Okay, when you subject the body to a considerable, more violent set of afflictions. When you get chemochemical therapy and radiation therapy to cancer to try to kill the cancer cells, and in turn, what you're also doing is that you're killing all the healthy tissue around the cancer as well. In the hopes of killing off the cancer. So in a nutshell, early American medical care. If you had money, you could see a doctor. If you saw a doctor, you might die. Okay, so you're really better off a lot just going with home remedies and taking care of your afflictions at home. About the mid 1800s, group of respectable physicians got together and they formed the American Medical Association with the intent of trying to weed out all of these human experimentation and all the frauds that were in the healthcare system in the US. Because there was a lot of people going around claiming to be a doctor, and some people that were less educated that weren't really living by this do no harm rule that physicians were supposed to live under. They're really going out and cutting people's heads open to alleviate headaches. Doing things that didn't really work, and a lot of patients were dying off. And it was really giving the profession that was in its infancy stages, really giving the physician's profession a bad name because people were scared. And so this group of physicians got together, they went to the government and they lobbied, and the government started passing some laws saying that, okay, well, if you're going to be a physician, then you have to have a license. We're going to start to regulate what you can do and what you cannot do. And you cannot practice medicine or say that you're a doctor if you're not registered with the government and get a license, and if you're not registered with the American Medical Association. So very early on with physician practice in the US, trying to weed out all this human experimentation and trying to really get physicians to the forefront, and the ones that wanted to do no harm and really wanted to help people, get them together and really start to build the healthcare system around them and start to, like I said, weed out some of this, the human experimentation. And when that kicked off, that's when a lot of studies started to take place, and when physicians in the US started to gain a little bit of momentum. I had talked about on a previous slide in about the 1850, about the mid 1800s, big medical advance was the discovery of microorganisms, right? That directly led to the discovery of penicillin, to treat microorganisms, to kill off bacteria so that you didn't have to get amputations so easily, and so that these communicable diseases wouldn't spread so rapidly, so that you can treat infectious disease. Okay, because in the early 1900s, infectious disease, that's what killed out a lot of people. Okay, discovery of penicillin started curing infectious disease, started getting rid of dysentery, started getting rid of yellow fever. And up until that point, I mean, physicians and what they did was relatively inexpensive. You could see a doctor and you didn't really have to spend a lot of money, because, I mean, it didn't really, what doctors were doing really didn't work until the discovery of penicillin is when things started really taking off and when doctors started getting some momentum. Okay, you could go to a doctor now if you had a disease or had an affliction, get penicillin, and you'd be cured, instead of going to a doctor and getting half of your head lopped off and dying. And so the profession started growing to be more respectful again. You can go see a doctor, you would survive, you would get well, you would get better. Life expectancy grew tremendously when penicillin was discovered and used. Okay, and now that physicians had something, right, they had a successful treatment, that's when they started charging more for their services. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, there was a company up in Massachusetts called Franklin Health Assurance Company. And what they did was they offered individual workers that were working on railroads and steamboats, they offered them insurance policies. If you got hurt working on the railroad or working on a steamboat, and if you had one of the Franklin Health Assurance, if you had an insurance policy, and if you got hurt, then you would be compensated for lost wages. Okay, and this was groundbreaking and important, because this is the first, this is the beginnings of work insurance policies. Okay, while this one right here did not pay for medical expenses, it covered lost wages if you got hurt. Okay, and that one that was started coming out, the Franklin Health Assurance Company, that was an injury insurance policy that company sold directly to employees. Okay. In the early 1900s was when employers themselves started taking out group disability policies to cover their entire workforce. For example, if you were a large railroad and you had a lot of railroad track to lay down, it was very competitive back in those days. In order for your company to attract good workers away from a competitor, you would take out a disability policy on your workforce. So therefore, if somebody was hurt while building the railroad, you could cover their lost wages for them. And we're talking about somebody working on a railroad getting hurt. We're not talking about like today how somebody has carpal tunnel syndrome. Okay, we're talking about if you're using dynamite to to mine through a hill or something, and then you blow half of your leg off. Okay. These group insurance policies would pay for your disability, your lost wages, but it still did not cover medical expenses. So you were still on the hook that if you had to go to a doctor to be seen in order to get medical treatment, okay, you still paid for that out of your pocket. The insurance policy did not pay for it. It just kept you whole as far as your wages were concerned. You got hurt, it paid for your wages. And so when you went and saw a doctor, you paid for that out of your pocket. And this is where the origins of what was called the fee-for-service model sort of started taking shape. And fee-for-service is a physician reimbursement model, meaning that when you go to the doctor, if the doctor performs 3 or 4 different services to you, the doctor will charge you 3 or 4 different charges for each one of the services. Like, for example, if you go to Publix and you buy a grocery cart full of, say, 10 different items, you go to the checkout clerk. The checkout clerk charges you for 10 different items. It's fee per product. Back in the day when you saw a doctor, it was fee for service. For every service the doctor would do to you, they would charge you a fee. Okay, and we'll come back. We'll talk about that more. That's a very important concept to understand, and I don't want you to learn that over this PowerPoint. We'll talk about that in class. In the early 20th century, when hospitals started to take shape, what hospitals were was really more of a poor or an indigent haven. It was a community shelter where if you were homeless, you were poor, you didn't have anywhere to go, you could go to the community hospital. Okay, it was set up just to service these local communities, and they offered what the hospitals did was they offered services directly to consumers within the community on sort of a prepaid basis. So, for example, a representative of the hospital would go out into the local community and would go, say, door to door, and you would pay into a prepaid plan of 10 cents a month, let's say. And then over the course of the year, every month you would pay the hospital 10 cents. And over the course of the year, if you or one of your family members were sick, you would go to the hospital, get treated, and then you go back home. You didn't have to pay because you had been paying for it all year by paying 10 cents, 25 cents a month to the hospital. Okay, so this is what's called a prepaid service. Okay, and that idea is what led directly to the formation of Blue Cross hospital insurance later on in the 1930s, because this idea of prepaid services, you paying a monthly fee to the hospital, whether you were sick or not, didn't matter. You were paying a monthly fee to the hospital. And then when you did get sick, you could go to the hospital and be seen. Okay, that became very popular. And we're gonna talk about that in class as well. I'm just gonna introduce that concept to you right now. About that same time, down in Dallas, Texas, there was a group of teachers teaching public schools that had band together, and what they did is that they started paying into an employer-sponsored hospital insurance program, to where every payday these teachers would take, they agreed upon let's say $1 a piece, and they put it into a bank account, and every paycheck, every one of this group of 10 teachers, they would put a certain amount of money, that whatever the agreed upon amount was, let's just say $1, they paid into this bank account. And then when one of those 10, when they would get sick, they had an agreement with a local hospital in place that they would go to the hospital, be seen, and then would go home, and they wouldn't get charged. Okay, their employer sponsored bank account would cover that employee. Okay. And this is sort of the early development of an HMO. And I'm just mentioning that real quick. Don't worry about it if that's a concept that you can't understand right now, and it's a little bit hard to understand, over this recorded PowerPoint. Again, we're going to talk about it in class because that's a pretty important thing to understand. But just take away is that in the early 20th century is when we started to get this concept of prepaid hospital services started to form. And it became very successful. Doctors were sitting back in their communities watching the hospitals start to become profitable and selling their services directly to consumers, directly to patients, whether they needed the service or not. But was sort of, it was an insurance program. It's there if you need it. And so doctors started doing the same things, right? Medical technology became more sophisticated. physicians, what they were doing was becoming more and more successful, especially when penicillin came about. So the cost of medical care started to go up as research was going up, technology was increasing, consumer demand was on the rise. And so physicians in their local neighborhoods and in their local communities, they would go around and start offering their services on a prepaid basis. Okay, they would go to all of their patients, and patients would pay the doctor, say, a monthly fee of $1, let's say. And every month you would pay the doctor $1. Whether you were sick or not did not matter. Okay, but when you did get sick, the doctor would come to your house, you'd be treated, and then the doctor would leave. You wouldn't have to pay any extra because you were already in that prepaid plan. Okay, the same thing that the hospital was doing, now physicians were starting to do. And this paved the way for Blue Shield private insurance. Blue Cross was a prepaid hospital insurance company. Blue Shield formed as a prepaid physician's insurance plan. And before long, because over the early part of the 20th century, that grew in popularity. It was very successful. That was an actual company that started, and Blue Cross Hospital Insurance, Blue Shield Physician Insurance formed, or they merged and became Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And we'll talk about that more in class as well, but I just want to introduce the topic to you, okay? In other countries, and other developing nations around the globe, such as England, Germany, a lot of European nations, okay? What was happening over there in those developing nations, at the same time that this idea of prepaid insurance in the United States was starting to gain popularity, in other developing nations, as jobs grew, right, as industry took off, manufacturing was taking off in other countries as well, and jobs were starting to increase, their governments started to form a national health insurance system, to where the government would collect a tax, usually in the form of either a property tax or an employment tax, meaning that the government would take taxes out of your paycheck, or they would tax you every year on the land that you would own, okay, or both. Okay, governments were taking taxes from workers and taking that tax money, and then in turn creating a government health or a government hospital system and doctor system, so that when anybody in the country would get sick, you could go to the hospital, be seen, and go home, and you'd never see a bill. So what was paying for those doctors, what was paying for those hospitals? Well, it was taxes. It was a national health insurance plan, or a universal health insurance model. Okay, and that was becoming very successful in those other developing nations. But in the US, what was gaining popularity was that prepaid services plan, or this insurance idea. And that was making a lot of money for doctors and for hospitals. But not everybody had access to affordable health care, because if you didn't have any money to pay for those prepaid plans, then you couldn't see a doctor. So in the United States, as commercial insurance starts to take off, in other developing nations, a universal health insurance and universal health and medical access started to take off in other countries through taxes and through the government. And so in 1935, right, the Social Security Act, who was Franklin Roosevelt, okay, when they passed the Social Security Act, what they did was that they threw in there a national insurance plan, or some sort through taxes, okay, so that everybody in the U.S., regardless of your employment status, regardless of age, that through taxes you could go see a doctor, go to the hospital, get what you need, and then you would go. So, like what's happening in other insurance, in other healthcare systems in the U.S. or in the globe. Okay, so that happened in other countries through national health insurance plan. But that didn't pass. Okay, heavy opposition from the American Medical Association shot down the original Social Security Act. Government did not pass it. Physicians hospitals, insurance companies did not want universal health insurance through the government. They wanted this insurance idea, this private insurance idea to keep taking off because it was very popular. Doctors were getting paid, insurance companies were starting to get paid, hospitals were getting paid. Okay, big business shut it down. And so then when the Social Security Act was passed finally, but after Roosevelt took out the National Health Insurance Program part. And we're going to talk about that more in class as well. So the United States becomes the only industrialized nation, really the only nation on the planet, but at the time the industrialized nations as they were growing, becomes the only industrialized nation not to develop a national health insurance plan. Okay, we were developing a private insurance, a private health insurance market. World War II came and completely shifted the landscape of medical insurance, of medical access in the United States. The Blue Cross and the Blue Shield models, those health insurance for prepaid services through hospitals and physicians, that was very successful, and now competition was starting to spawn. Like today, how you see Blue Cross and Blue Shield, you see Aetna, right? Some big insurers. So those competitions started to spawn, different insurance companies. So when World War II came around, interesting thing happened. There was a worker shortage, right? A lot of men left the factories, left jobs, and they went over and they fought the war. Those that did not go were left behind to be able to produce not only wartime goods, but also just regular domestic goods of what we needed from factories. And there was a lot of stress to put all of these wartime and domestic goods out. And there was not enough people to fill all the jobs that we needed. And so what was happening was that big business was were offering higher wages to fill the jobs that they had. And smaller businesses could not compete with the higher wages that big business was offering. So small business could not hire people, so small business could not produce goods and services during World War II, so they went out of business. So the government tried to level the playing field, and they imposed a wage restriction, saying that no matter if you're a large business or a small business, if you're hiring for a factory worker, let's say, you can only hire them at $2 an hour. Okay, so they tried to level the playing field. But big business stepped in and said, well, all right, if you're going to handcuff me on what I can pay my employees, then at least let me offer them non-money compensation. And that's where the idea of a benefits packages started to come from. So now so large businesses, they could only offer somebody $2 an hour to come work in their factory. But what they also did was they started offering paid vacation days, right? Sick days. And one of the main components of fringe benefits was medical insurance. So businesses started to offer compensation packages around medical and health insurance. And the government said, hey, that's a good idea. We're going to give you a tax break if you do that. And so big businesses and medium-sized businesses, as they could, or any type of business that could afford to do so, started offering the maximum wage that they could, and they also started tacking on benefit packages for their employees. And that really became successful and really spawned commercial insurance. Okay, if you got a job, you got health insurance. Okay. But what's the negative? The downside of that was, well, if you didn't have a job, you weren't going to get medical insurance. What if you were poor? What if you were homeless or indigent? What if you were a day laborer, meaning that it wasn't a full-time job you had? Day laborers were very popular down at working the shipyards and working the docks and working railroads. Okay, you would show up in the morning. The manager would come out and say, hey, I need 5 people. Pluck 5 people out off the street, and you'd come work for the day, a day laborer. Okay. What if you were self-employed or a small company and you couldn't afford to offer health insurance? Or what if you didn't work altogether? If you were elderly, if you were retired, if you were handicapped, if you were hurt. Okay. Those people in society could not get health insurance. So commercial insurance, if you had a job, started to take off. But there were gaps, like we said. Some people couldn't get insurance. And with the rising cost of healthcare now, because what doctors were doing was starting to work, healthcare started in the U.S. started to become unattainable. It was too expensive. So 1965, Lyndon Johnson, 1965, his administration, they wanted to start to fill some of the gaps in. So they passed Medicare, Medicaid. Right? Medicare is a government health insurance program that is given to those that are disabled or if they're 65 and older. Okay, there's two parts to Medicare, there's two parts to Medicare. Part A pays for hospital services, Part B pays for physician services. And then the Medicaid program followed after that. Medicaid was a health insurance program for poor and indigent people, okay, or homeless. There's an income restriction on who can qualify for Medicaid and who can't. Medicaid is considered to be a social welfare program. Okay. And so Medicare, Medicaid, these are governmental health insurance programs paid for by taxes. Okay. And so what happened was people literally went to bed one day without health insurance, woke up the next day, they had health insurance. And so if you have health insurance now, what are you going to do with it? You're going to use it. And we're going to talk about this more in class, okay? But the purpose of it right now is that 1965 Medicare, Medicaid, okay? The government, Lyndon Johnson's administration tried to fill in some of the gaps of who did not have medical insurance, okay? And the problem with it is that it just exploded. It became way more expensive than what that administration had anticipated. Way more expensive. Because like I said, if you did not have health insurance and then one day you wake up and you do have it, okay, well, you're going to use it. And a lot of people qualified and a lot of people used it. And we're going to talk more about that in class. Okay, so the healthcare system today. We never enacted a national insurance plan, all right, or a universal healthcare plan. We never enacted it. That boat has sailed and it will never happen in the U.S. And so what we had to do instead was we are patchworking together different programs to be able to get everybody in the U.S. access to affordable health care and affordable health insurance. Okay? If you have a job, you can get prepaid services or group health insurance, right? Medicare covers those that are disabled and elderly. Medicaid is an income restricted program that covers poor and indigent. Okay, so in the U.S., we're patchworking together different systems to try to get everybody health insurance versus pretty much every other country on the planet. They have a national insurance program paid for by the government. Okay, if you look at our system right now in the U.S., Medicare and Medicaid, I said before, exploded. It is way more expensive than what the Johnson administration had anticipated. In 2009, if you look at it, $3.5 trillion was the U.S. budget, was the U.S. government budget. Of that $3.5 trillion, almost a fifth of it went to Medicare and Medicaid expenses. Okay. That is $676 billion. That is a lot of money. Way more expensive than what they had anticipated. If you look at the cost of health insurance today, right, in the private sector, meaning that, you know, if you're at work, if you have a job and you're offered health insurance through your work, okay, the cost of you buying health insurance or your annual premium, it is increasing at an unsustainable rate. The cost of healthcare in the U.S. is going up tremendously every year and is becoming more and more expensive, less and less affordable. Okay, and over the course of the semester, we're going to talk about Medicare and Medicaid. okay, which is public health insurance. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about private health insurance, okay, premiums, deductibles, co-pays, things of that nature. And we're going to talk about why is the cost going up so much, okay? Technology, pharmaceuticals, uncompensated care in emergency departments are only some reasons why the cost of healthcare is going up so much in the US, okay? And we're going to talk about all of this stuff over the course of the semester. That's a YouTube video that talks about chronic diseases. Chronic disease is a huge reason why the cost of healthcare is going up so much in the US and it's becoming so unaffordable, okay? So this right here is stuff that we talked about in the first class, expectations, workload, et cetera, et cetera. If you have any questions, let me know. Again, we talked about all this stuff. This was just an introduction into the class. And a lot of the things, again, that I had talked about, we will come back and talk over the course of the semester.